In a country with a population of better than 380 million people and a huge landmass, it's very, very important to ask ourselves, where are we to invest in real estate? And there's a lot of different factors here, and we're going to take a more in-depth look at it through this next tutorial. Many markets from which to choose. How do I choose one? What are some of the indicators and trends that we need to be very cautious of? One of the most important things, and we'll take a very in-depth look at this here in just a few, is should I follow the herds into what are referred to as hot markets? And how are we able to predict future market trends in those areas? Why don't we look back in time a little bit and get a better overall picture. What we're looking at right now is a heat map from 2009, and this was the foreclosure activity in the United States. It's not real hard to see. If we look to the left and the right of the map, it's the coastal communities that had the highest concentration of foreclosures, and also in the Southwest. What we find in looking at this map is the areas that are red were also extremely overdeveloped. This is where artificial home prices had skyrocketed, and these were also the areas that took the biggest fall in real estate values when the foreclosure market hit. There was a flood of inventory and not enough people to buy and or live in these properties. So really half the battle in this whole real estate thing is just like it says on our header here. How to avoid roller coaster markets where highs spike to ridiculous heights and then crash to historic lows. Now, bullet point one, in many markets, like some that will actually be illustrated in this tutorial a bit later on, prices most likely will never recover to pre-recession highs. Repeat that. Never recover to pre-recession highs. If we're going to be conservative investors, we need to come to terms with something. In markets that were completely overdeveloped, more homes there than there were people to live in them, or buy them, or lease them. Those markets were so inflated and have left such a saturation of homes on the market that that historic high price that was driven by speculation, that the homes would be even worth more money up the road than they were today, that's unrealistic. They'll never see those highs again. Now, bullet point two, historic lows are much more accurate as to where prices will adjust in another down economy, such as the one that the U.S. is experiencing today, and much like during the pre-meltdown times. So if we're going to be conservative here, consistency in home pricing index for specific markets is essential in determining future valuations and where the HPI will readjust with changes in the economic environment, which typically are showing that we're kind of hitting a bottom basement here right now. So what we need to do if we really want to consider future valuations was right before the market crash, where were prices at that point in time? And that's probably more realistic, is where prices will adjust. Not upwards, downwards. So when we're looking for valuations, let's look where those prices were at before the crazy spike upward and where they've adjusted to now. And let's come to terms with the fact that they're never, ever going to be on those high points ever again. So in avoiding the roller coaster ride, what we need to do is we need to remember, by looking at the coastal areas in the Southwest, areas that were super high in concentrations of foreclosures. Those are the markets that had been overdeveloped, more homes than there were people to live in them. But investing in saturated markets, such as up and down the coasts, and markets that have experienced dramatic highs and then dramatic lows, is a risky endeavor at best. And it is the same type of speculative real estate maneuvering that created the entire housing crash in the first place. Investing in markets that had a small upward spike and then a small downward spike and then adjusted in the middle is a pretty safe and reliable place to invest. What we don't want to do is we don't want to follow these market trends and look at those dark red communities that experience the worst of the roller coaster effect and think that today those are a smart place to invest. At least once a day I get phone calls from folks asking us if we'd be willing to provide some type of a financing component for properties that they either own or would like to purchase in markets other than the ones in which we're active in. And unfortunately, my response to them is always no. And where I get the most requests from for this type of assistance is in what I call, or what we're going to refer to as, these roller coaster markets, where home valuations were ridiculously high. They were not driven by the price of the real estate, but by the sheer amount of development that was happening there. Unfortunately, with the development happening, there was more property being developed than there were people to either buy or live in these properties. And on the left is Atlanta, on the right is Phoenix, perfect examples. Now, what this kind of looks like is a guy that was on the emergency room table when they hit him with the paddles. An absolute huge upshoot there, and they reached increasingly ridiculous high valuations, and then they took a tumble. These are the type of markets that we try to avoid. These are not areas that we invest our money in. These are not the types of areas where we choose to invest our own real estate dollars. And we're trying to find a little bit more consistent pattern in the housing price indexes, which is what we're looking at. Despite the market trends, what we see is a absolute herd of investors, not just American investors, but Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, Chinese, all folks of nationalities that we've worked with in the past, that are flooding to a lot of these overdeveloped roller coaster markets. Unfortunately, they have not learned from the lessons of the past, and it's repeating itself today. And let's look at the four basic things here. By the time everyone else is doing something, it is usually too late. I know of at least 5 large firms that deal with individual buyers and provide them either coaching or information as to where to invest. And next thing you know, there's in particular 6 or 8 markets right now where this company that had 5,000 people is looking at, this company that's dealing with 2,000 people are looking at. Unfortunately, by following the masses, markets are artificially driven up by other investors. So when we're seeing more housing price increases, the HPI is readjusting upwards in a lot of these roller coaster markets. It's being driven by investors, not by homeowners, not by new development, not by lease options. It's being artificially driven up by one investor bidding against the other. Number 3, the hedge fund guys are pretty darn smart. So are the private equity firms that are focusing on real estate. Institutional investors have already depleted the markets of viable assets. And number 4, as mentioned, a proliferation of investor purchased properties starts the roller coaster ride again in valuations. So in certain markets, some of which we've already looked at, a couple more we're going to take a peek at, the roller coaster ride is continuing, and it's being driven by investors. I just mentioned here in the last frame how proliferations of investors and investment purchase properties kickstarts the roller coaster ride all over again. And here's a couple other markets. On the left is Las Vegas, and on the right is the Central Florida and Orlando area. And again, here we see starting in 2000 just an upward spike that really provided unrealistic valuations for properties. And once the credit party had ended, here it went into an absolute nosedive. And then in between 2010 and 2013, we're starting to see that same upward trend again. They're far from adjusted to what's regular. And when we look at where properties were at in, say, 2000, and the direction that they're headed again, going straight upwards, this again is a clear indicator of what happens in these roller coaster markets that are A, overdeveloped, B, have unrealistic high pricing valuations, see what happens when they tumble. And with the investor market being driven again, we're starting to see that same roller coaster pattern beginning now. So let's take a quick overview about these roller coaster markets. Number one, overdeveloped markets, such as the ones with these dramatic highs and lows, are becoming saturated with rental properties. Every investor on the face of the planet wants to buy in certain overdeveloped markets, and where it's supposed to be hot and it's up and down. They buy those. They're not buying them to live in. They're buying them as rentals. Number two, unsophisticated investors tend to saturate those markets. And what they do is they drive up the prices, artificially drive up the prices of properties, creating the same wild upward trend that has occurred in the past. All we have to do is revert back to some of those up and down roller coaster charts that we looked at, and here it is, hit bottom, now it's going up again, going to drop again soon. They're unsustainable. Number three, too much investment in these saturated markets blurs the distinction between owners and renters. Owner versus renter neighborhoods and subdivisions are further devalued. So ultimately what we look for is we want to be on a street of responsible homeowners, financially secure and sound homeowners, people that have their families embedded in the neighborhood and in the community. We want the only rental there, because what that does is that attracts other people that have the same characteristics as the neighbors around them. And at the bottom here, with the saturation of investors buying rental properties in high-low markets, there becomes a surplus of rental properties. What we don't want is we don't want to have a situation that I ran into in Phoenix a few years back. I flew back there. I was looking to buy property and absorb it into our firm. However, I would go out to huge subdivisions, 100, 120, 130, 40, 50 homes, and what we found is that every single property in that subdivision either had a for sale sign or a for rent sign. Basically overdeveloped, and the only thing that's going to end up happening in those types of subdivisions and in some of these different markets is that you're going to have brand new homes that are in nothing but rental communities. Again, we do not want to be where there's a saturation of renters. All right, well, I think we've pretty well detailed what constitutes a roller coaster market. Hopefully you've come to the conclusion that that's not an area that you want to be investing your money into. And the next logical thing we need to take a peek at is what are some of the characteristics of good markets and what do we want to try to get into now that we know what to avoid. Point number one, steady markets were never overdeveloped, so there is not a surplus of inventory. We're going to take a closer look at that in some of the slides to come so you can get a better visual. In plain language, there are not more homes than there are people to buy, to rent, or to live in them. Period. It's very simple. If there's not an excess of housing, then rentals remain at a premium. Number two, the ideal asset, which is a beautiful home in a primarily owner-occupied neighborhood, is easier to rent to desirable tenants. We just covered that. Again, we want to have a highly qualified tenant, one that's very, very desirable to have, steady job history, steady rent history, young family. They're attracted by the school districts. They want to embed their kids into the school system and stay there. Those are the people that we want to go ahead and try to attract. And the way we do that is having the only rental property in a subdivision or on a street. A couple things that I do want to point out now, regardless of if you're in a good or bad market, Section 8 housing is an extremely volatile endeavor. I don't care what you've heard about it, stay away from it. Whatever it may cash flow in a year, they come through, they do a reinspection, and quite often you're putting half of or sometimes all of what you've received in yield on those properties back into it just to keep it certified for another year. But what we want to find, and this is why it's all in bold letters, we want to be where home values have remained basically consistent in the past and continue to remain consistent today. That's the key. So let's do a side-by-side comparison of a roller coaster market as compared to one of the markets that we're actively involved in. When we look at Phoenix again, revisiting in here on the left, Here we get through 2000, property values start going up. 2005, a crazy upward spike. Unbelievable. It tops out, and then in 2009, during the credit crisis, a complete downward trend, just a bottom basement, terrible decline in property values. And then we blip up and down a little bit, and now it's starting to creep up again. So you see that same roller coaster ride starting to take place right now with another massive uptick. Let's look at Kansas City on the right. It's a gradual increase all the way through the 90s into 2000. Now in 2009, when we're at the absolute pinnacle of housing prices in Kansas City, compare the downward valuation of Kansas City on the right compared to the downhill property valuation in Phoenix on the left. Now, not only that, when we look at the right side of the Kansas City graph, prices have actually leveled out close to where they were when they were at the very high end of valuations. This is a steady and consistent market. Now let's take another look at a consistent market. We're going to revisit Atlanta here on the left. Here we see Atlanta, mid-1995 all the way through 2009, upward, upward, upward. What ends up happening? In 2009, a dramatic downhill roller coaster effect to where we hit the bottom basement here in about 2012, and it started to uptick, and it's adjusted well below the high end of the valuations. Now, let's take a look at Tulsa to the right. We see an upward trend in 75 all the way through 95. It takes a little dip, but in 1990, the housing price index started to raise. And it continued the same downward trend in all these other markets in 2009 was in effect that the city of Tulsa and the real estate in Tulsa, according to the Standard & Poor Moody Index, did not take this dramatic tumble. In fact, it's leveled off. And if you look at the far right-hand side of the graph, property values in Tulsa right now are about where they were prior to the mortgage meltdown. This is another example of a steady and consistent market. So to take a look at the big picture, folks, this is the change in U.S. housing prices between 2000 and 2010. Now, this is just after post-recession. 2000 to 2006, before the crash, all the highlighted states that you see indicate where the property values were skyrocketing upward. Now, 2006 to 2010, to the right of that, a lot of these same areas are highlighted. Now, that's not a valuation. The change in housing prices during that period is a downward decline. So we look at the overall 10-year matrix here, from 2000 to 2010, the highlighted areas, as I had mentioned, were the areas in coastal communities primarily. But if we look in 2000 to 2006 and 2006 to 2010, a lot of the areas that are very, very active and considered hotbeds of investment, those are the ones that are highlighted. We avoid those markets like the plague. So assuming we've made a decision as to where we want to buy, what city, which one of these economic indicators or housing price indexes you as an investor choose to pursue, let's take a look at valuing properties and how to accurately determine the true value of a property. Well, let's start by looking at what is not a proper valuation tool. First and foremost, any computer-based search engine such as Zillow, Cyberhomes, Trulia.com, Realtor.com are not accurate. These research tools do not make any distinction between a beautifully rehabbed home designed to attract an A-grade tenant and pre-rehab houses. In fact, next point down, the information is dated and reflects activity over a long period of time. What a property is listed for or was sold for is not accurate on these sites, and many times the valuations in these sites is referring to the foreclosure amount and not the actual sales price to an investor or a homeowner that is being able to become qualified to get a mortgage to purchase the property. In other words, the period of time from which these sites draw from, the condition of properties, whether it was a pre-foreclosure amount at the courthouse steps or actually a check that was written to buy the property, none of this is able to be distinguished by looking at these tools. The valuations are incorrect, property information is dated, and it's very, very hard to compare apples to apples when one of these homes may be a 4-bedroom, 2-bath that sold, according to Zillow or Trulia, for $40,000, and a 2-bedroom, 1-bath house 2 blocks over that sold for $60,000. We have to compare apples to apples. If we're comparing apples to oranges, we're not going to get a true valuation, and that's what happens on these computer-generated search engines. So the next logical question that we have to ask ourselves, how to accurately determine the true value of a property, what is a proper valuation tool? In effect, the only proper valuation which is both accurate and that reflects recent activity in a specific subdivision is the MLS system, the multiple listing services and comps that are drawn from MLS. To remind a lot of people, MLS is the search engine that holds all of the data for area realtors. In other words, it reflects purchased properties, how much they were purchased for, when they were purchased, how long it sat on the market before it went. It'll also pull our low-end comps, and we'll be able to look into those comps and see, why did it sell low? Because it was in terrible shape, because the furnace and the utilities are completely shot. It gives us a more accurate picture, and only by drawing on realtor data that's exclusively available to these realtors, can we accurately determine if we're comparing an apple to an orange or an apple to an apple. Realtor comps should be specific to a neighborhood or subdivision and should never ever be expanded to an area greater than a quarter mile from the asset that's being evaluated. A lot of realtors, to go ahead and justify a overpriced property in one subdivision, will extend their search criteria or their searches out within a mile or 2 miles. This is incorrect. Again, we're not comparing apples to apples. What we need to do is we need to bear in mind that once we get outside maybe a subdivision or a quarter mile away from a target asset, the demographics, the owner versus tenant relationship to these neighborhoods can dramatically change. A mile is a long distance in real estate, folks, so what we want to do is we want to make sure that we're staying inside of a subdivision or within a very, very small, compressed, outward search area. Comprehensive comp should always be provided as part of preliminary due diligence. If you can't get accurate realtors comps for within a quarter mile to substantiate the amount of money you're willing to pay for a house, then you should not buy it. And last of all, to reach top market comps for a specific area or subdivision, the renovations and rehab work must be extensive and of the highest quality. Let's take a look. If we've got a house on one side of the street that's been renovated and it has granite countertops, stainless steel appliances, custom landscaping, you cannot compare that property to the one across the street that has Formica, used appliances, and the yard looks terrible. If I put tile in a house that sells for $120,000 on one side of the street, if I want to get top market value on the other side of the street, I have to have tile there. We have to be able to present our property with the same type of improvements that have been made with other properties that are at that high end of the comp scale. So let's assume for a minute that you've went ahead and decided to invest in a good, stable market. And let's further assume that you found a property, the comps seem to pan out, and you found a company that's willing to go ahead and do the renovation and rehab and turn it over in top-notch condition. That brings us to the next big question, and that is how to accurately determine the true quality of the property. Well, it's real easy to take pictures, folks. In fact, I can turn the camera 1 foot to the left or right and miss a big hole in a wall, a part of the room that was left unfinished, or where we did a half measure. However, Even though picture evidence is good, preferably video evidence must be supplied to a buyer so that they can truly appreciate the finished work and the quality of the property. When we finish a property, we go in there with the video production crew and we capture every square inch of every room. Now, that includes the walls, the floors, the ceilings, the lighting, the plugs, the switches, the HVAC registers. Every square inch of that house is something that should be viewed by any buyer prior to closing on a property. Plain and simple. You want to know that the quality is very, very high and that it's been beautifully rehabbed. Now, picture video evidence should always include visuals of the neighborhood and the surrounding homes. Nobody wants the only nice house in a terrible neighborhood. So what we also want to see, we want to see outside pans of the neighborhood so that we can determine, do we have a house that's relevant to the neighborhood in which it's in? Is our house one of among a whole bunch of beautiful homes in a primarily owner-occupant neighborhood? That's the key here. We want to be the only beautiful rental home in a neighborhood of responsible homeowners, responsible families. And in doing so, we can draw a responsible, financially prudent tenant and never have, like I mentioned, the only gorgeous home in a bad neighborhood. Suburb communities and specific pocket areas tend to be the best kept and most well-maintained areas. That's why you want to also have a pan of the neighborhood. What we want is we want a beautiful house on a street full of other beautiful houses with a whole bunch of financially responsible owner-occupants, and that allows us to put another financially responsible tenant-occupant in there, and they are going to feel right at home and never want to leave. And what ends up happening is when we follow this purchasing matrix, when we follow these simple steps to having successful investment properties, there are no long-term vacancies in those underdeveloped markets. If we look at the two properties on the bottom, both the house on the left and the house on the right had tenants that had signed leases and were ready to move in prior to completion. Before the paint on the wall dried, we had a well-qualified, responsible tenant with a young family ready to move into these properties. And here's a couple more of our properties. Both the house on the left and the house on the right had tenants that had signed the lease and were prepared to move in within 30 days of completion. You see, what our goal is here is not to have one tenant make an application, move into a house, and be grateful to have them. What we want is we want only well-qualified tenants in all of our properties. We want them to fill out the application. We screen their criminal background histories, their work history, their rental history, number of kids. If we can, we want to know the name of their dog. And by carefully screening people to move into beautiful homes like we're looking at right now, in neighborhoods where all the other homes are just as majestic and just as beautiful, we eliminate those long-term vacancies that you will experience in other markets that are completely overdeveloped. If either one of these houses were sitting in an overdeveloped market, they would have been one of another 20 rentals on that street, which drives pricing up and it drives the rent values down. And if you would like any more information on our properties, areas that we have properties available, or about our program in general, please feel free to contact us, info@inlawinvestments.com, and thank you very much for your time.